So welcome everyone. I'm Hillary Kane. I'm a member of the Green Party's Coordinated Campaign Committee, which is the committee that supports candidates and campaigns. We provide training monthly, depending on the year, but we basically have a webinar series where we try to go through kind of in sync with the electoral calendar, different aspects of campaigning and really trying to make sure that folks have the tools that they need to run for office. So I am going to get us started. Let me share screen. Oops, let me get off of somebody's info. Here we go. And let's present this. So this is actually a composite presentation. The original slide deck, I think, was created by me years ago. Last year, Gloria and Michael, both from New York, presented, and they sort of took my original slides and adapted it and added their own stuff. And it was definitely an improvement. So this year I decided to use their slides instead of my original in order to sort of do this presentation. So I'm going to certainly give credit to Gloria and Michael for their adaptations. But we're going to dive right in. So basically, this call is really about debriefing your run. And it's really important that I think folks take a step back and, learn the lessons. Hopefully, there's an activist, Miles Horton, who famously said, you only learn from the experiences you learn from. And so, the idea is that you actually have to take stock. You have to, take a moment, debrief, pause, reflect, and think about what you actually accomplished and learned from your campaign so that you can then, take that information and add it to the next campaign and really improve both your own process and, skills and talents, but as well as the party and for the future candidate who might run after you, whether that's you or some other green. And so we're really talking about a systematic process to learn lessons from this most recent election cycle. And really, what worked, what didn't, what would you do differently if and when you run again next time? What are the things that can be institutionalized or transferred to your local or state party? And, really this needs to be something that's baked into your campaign plan and shouldn't be an afterthought. And then the last thing is just, the who is involved. Obviously, campaigns can, have tons of people involved from, random volunteers, donors. But I think for the type of thing that we're talking about tonight, we're really talking about sort of the core campaign leadership. So the folks who are involved, in major decision making, in leading major aspects of the campaign. At some point you kind of have to draw the line somewhere, but, I think you'll know what the right group is based on, who did you bring together on a regular basis to sort of help shape the campaign as it was evolving. That's the group that you want to bring back together to be a part of the debrief. So I think obviously in terms of a process, we've all, figured out how to use Zoom, and you can certainly do this via video conference, especially if you were running a statewide campaign and you have key supporters and key people who are part of that are spread all over. I, of course, always preference a face-to-face meeting. I think it's just always better, if you can be in person to do that. But, given the times that we're in, that may or may not be possible. I think it's also important to really have something that is facilitated by a neutral third party who's trusted by most people at the table. I think, you definitely don't want the candidate facilitating this, or even the campaign manager, because a lot of times it can be too personal and too, you were so in the weeds and you may not be able to sort of see things through that sort of distance that other folks might see. Campaigns can get, especially if they're sort of very, high level and intense, they can be sort of very, there's a lot of drama. There's a lot of it's just a very high stakes kind of, race to the finish. And sometimes, that engenders, some internal disputes and whatever. And so you definitely want someone who is sort of either unaffiliated and sort of above that all. It could be someone from the party who just wasn't very involved in the campaign. It could be a Green Party leader from another state or another community who again wasn't directly involved, but knows campaigns and that type of thing. So just someone who everyone feels comfortable with, who can kind of move the conversation along. You definitely want to allow enough time to do this. I think the ideal would be like essentially a day-long retreat. But if you're doing it on Zoom, obviously a full day on Zoom is kind of tiresome and hard to focus. So you also could break it up into like a few like time, like a few weekends in a row or a couple of things over time, all in 1 week or whatever, to sort of do small chunks. But I think there's a lot that you can really get into. So it's really what you can set aside, as much as you put in is what you're going to get out. Another thing to think about is not just a debriefing event or retreat for key leadership, but to also think about a broader survey or some other feedback mechanism from that sort of larger concentric circle of sort of volunteers. And so I know one year, one of the campaigns that we ran here in Philadelphia, we did a survey for every single person who was volunteering on election day, which is probably the largest number of people we had at any one given point. So maybe we had, I don't know, 50 or 60 people volunteering on election day. And all of those people got a survey about both their election day experiences, but also their sort of feelings about the campaign overall. And someone compiled that into a really nice report that was actually, I think, useful and helped us think about, what is this experience like for sort of our average volunteer who's not necessarily like in the weeds and in the thick of things, making decisions and, sort of in the core team. And then I think the other thing, and this is obviously hard to do, I mean, this is kind of why we want to have this call right away, is that, we want to encourage folks to do these kinds of debriefs soon after the campaign. My thought here is ideally before Thanksgiving, but certainly before the end of the calendar year, because the more time passes, the more, the more people just get sort of distracted and refocused on other aspects of their lives, and they don't necessarily have time for this anymore. But also you tend to forget, like it wasn't in the moment. And, the thing that really you wanted to discuss or pick apart, might be sort of seem less important, 3, 4, 5 weeks later. And so I think, if you can sort of, do this while everything is still fresh in everyone's mind, that's really all to the better. Yes, Holly.
I just wanted to mention, as just a side note, I think especially adding the survey is extremely helpful and important. I think it allows volunteers to feel more appreciated. And there's always some volunteer appreciation that you want to do anyway. But the nice thing about this is sometimes there are things and there are issues that you really need to hear that aren't going to necessarily come up through the core group. I think we've both Hillary and I have seen this, and Scott probably too have seen this has happened. And it's a really good way and a calm way, I think, to get sometimes needed. And it's not always the case, but I do encourage people to use that. I think it's a very good component. Why that's left.
Yeah. Right. I mean, I think just like any operation, right, those are the people who are sort of really close in the mix. It's kind of hard to, see what does this look like from the outside, or what does this look like from a person who's only sort of mildly involved, who's maybe not, fully drinking the Kool-Aid or whatever, who's still maybe on the fence about the Green Party or on the fence about politics in general. And I think just wanting to get sort of that variety of feedback is important. All right, so here's a sample agenda. It's a little long, and certainly you don't need to like use this verbatim, but obviously, and this is, I think, designed for more of an in-person, like full day retreat. But, some of the basics are like, right, obviously welcome, icebreakers, introductions. At that point, hopefully, everyone knows everyone at this point. But, obviously you want to start with the positives, right? So what went well, right? Like, you think about the whole campaign, what worked well? What were the successes? And they can be qualitative and quantitative, right? So, very specific numbers, like whether it's votes or, donations, other metrics you might have on social media, whatever. There's definitely ways to like count success. And then there might be other sort of more nuanced things like a key ally that was developed, or even like a new young leader who sort of came, who became, sort of, got discovered sort of during the campaign. So what were the successes? What worked well? And then the big thing I think, which is really hard for a lot of campaigns, is how did those successes match the goals that were articulated at the beginning of the campaign? And so for those of you who are new to our webinar series and to my presentations, like I also do a spiel usually in February on, goal setting. And I think this is the step that a lot of campaigns miss, or they simply just say like, our goal is to win and leave it at that, right? Really a well-structured campaign, particularly a Green Party campaign, really needs to not just articulate winning as a goal, which is obviously, important, but like, well, what does it take to win? Like, how many votes actually will it take in this particular race? And if that is not realistic because of being outspent, being, a third party candidate where the mainstream media is ignoring you, whatever, like, well, what is the number of votes that like would be a stretch goal for a green campaign building towards future success, but like have a vote target in mind, even if that vote target isn't actual winning. And other types of goals are also important. Number of volunteers, number of donors, number of new people who are recruited that haven't been involved before, building the party itself, people becoming Green Party members, perhaps gaining entry into new neighborhoods, social media visibility, there's 100 different types of goals that one could argue. And so ideally, if your campaign set those goals at the beginning, this is the time where you want to look back and say, all right, how did we do on those specific goals? Because the answer may be that, okay, we didn't necessarily win this election, but we were really hoping to increase our donor base by 10%, and we did. Or we were hoping to like get 30% more votes than the previous Green who ran in this seat 4 years ago, those kinds of things. So really think about what you did and how that compares with the goals at the beginning. And as I say here, if no goals were articulated, this is difficult to do. But it's still, I think, a useful exercise. Other things that you might want to do during that debriefing, this day-long retreat, is to really think about the elements you want to explore more deeply. And so like there's the campaign as a whole, and then, but as you'll see, because I'll get into a future slides, there's like 20 to 30 different like sub elements of the campaign, whether it's volunteer engagement or social media or fundraising. And so you could, depending on how your campaign went and what you were really focused on, go more deeply into any of those elements of campaigning and really, again, like what worked well and what didn't work well within this domain, within volunteer engagement, within fundraising, within social media, for example. You can't cover it all. Like you just can't cover 30 elements, right? Like that's just not realistic. Nobody has the brain span for that in a day, or it's just too much. And chances are your campaign didn't really do all 30 things, and certainly do them at the level, of consistency that it would be worth debriefing on. You can decide which ones you want to go into before you go into this, or you could have people, there's a common facilitation technique where, and I'm sure there's a virtual way to do this, but you sort of list all the things on the board, and then folks can sort of vote like, with sticker dots to say like, if you want to talk about this issue, like cast your vote, and maybe you have like 6 stickers, and you can sort of either bullet vote or you can put one on each of 6 things, and you can just kind of see where the group lies and what are the top things that people want to really discuss and engage with. And again, depending on the size of your group and the number of things you want to cover, you could also choose to go into each of those things as a whole, or you could split people up into smaller breakouts, right? So like these 3 people over here are going to discuss and debrief the media. These four people over here are going to discuss and debrief the volunteer engagement, et cetera, et cetera. And then of course, if you do that small group breakout thing, you want to obviously have people report back out and share their findings, have other people react, and you can do gallery walks if people have chart paper. Again, there's other virtual ways to do this, like through Jamboard, but you basically want to engage the group in a conversation about sort of the what went well and what didn't, and what can we learn from that. both from within the folks who were, sort of debriefed that focus area, as well as from the folks who were debriefing other focus areas. And I think, the big question that you want to sort of end on is like, if you did this again, right? If you chose to run for this same office, either 2 years or 4 years or whatever it is in your case, like what would you do differently? What have you built and what would you continue and what would you change? And then what capacities do you need to develop before then? So like if you at the end of the day realize like, wow, our social media was really lacking, like that's clearly a thing that you need to work on between now and 4 years from now. And so what are the ways that you can do that? How can you make a plan to sort of strengthen your ability and your capacity to do the things that you identified maybe weren't so hot this time around? And so, and it's not just for you as a potential current ongoing potential future candidate, but also for your local and state party to think about, what are the capacities that the party needs to develop, and infrastructure that it can build so that it can be more useful for future candidates in that regard. I think that's it on the sample agenda and sort of basic, things that we would want to cover. Any questions about this before I move on? I'm going to get into sort of some of the elements. Okay, great. So these are some of the campaign elements. Again, like you wouldn't necessarily debrief every single one because it's too much. But these are some of the ones that are kind of more external facing. So things that are perhaps beyond your control and what you can control as your candidate and campaign, but things that you might want to debrief or at least have even a broader discussion of, like for context setting before you get into some of the other elements. And this I can tell is something that I think Gloria and Michael added when they did this last year, is a post-campaign power map, sort of the who are, and so I joke like it's like who are the people in your neighborhood, sort of who are the actors in your community or in your jurisdiction that have influence, power, the ability to get things done, to move agenda items, whether it's like in city council or on the school board or whatever. And just think about, who are you connected, who are connected to those people, and did your campaign help you get new access to some of those key influencers, which could be useful, but in terms of your ongoing organizing between now and the next election. And Gloria, I see you're on the call, so if you want to jump in, feel free. I definitely, as I said at the beginning, you and Michael did this last year, building on a PowerPoint that I had started, and then you added to it. And so now I'm using this is the hybrid version because yours was certainly an improvement. So it's the Hillary / Gloria / Michael presentation.
Sure.
Okay, and then internal elements. I mean, and there's a ton, right? And there's probably more that we didn't even, consider here. But these are the typical things that we tend to work on when we're running campaigns, and these are the things that are more in our control, things that we're working on, right? So whether it's your campaign literature, the get out the vote effort, your ballot access, events, all of these things could be their own separate debrief. Ideally, when you're running a campaign, you'd have someone in charge of each of these things. Even obviously most green campaigns don't have the money to have paid staff on all these things, but do you have a key volunteer who's in charge of traditional media or fundraising, et cetera? So these are the kinds of elements that would, be good fodder for those sort of small breakouts during a debrief where people are sort of deep diving into one of these elements and really thinking about what worked, what didn't, what did we learn, what could we change? And then really, again, back to your sort of original campaign plan, assuming you had one, I think some serious soul searching is sometimes in order of like, if the numbers that were reality are very different from what you planned, well, why is that, right? And there's a bunch of reasons. Sometimes, and I think I've seen this in all green campaign, I've seen all of these things in green campaigns. Sometimes our expectations are just unrealistic, right? We have people who are running the very first time with like no budget, no contacts in the community, like no history of organizing, and they're like, I'm gonna win Senate. And because, like, of the rightness of my convictions, because I have the best platform and therefore everyone's just gonna see it. Those would be unrealistic expectations. And I think sometimes this happens. I think people, I once talked to I was working on a campaign for judge in Pennsylvania. And yes, in Pennsylvania, we elect our judges. And there was never, at the very beginning of the campaign, there was no chance that we were winning this race. Like, no one thought we could win. But at some point over the course of the year, like, the candidate and the people closest to him, like, really did think they could win. I was a little, like, 1 degree removed. And at some point I finally said something to somebody like, what has changed? Why do you think you can win? And the answer was like, because we're doing so much more than any other Green candidate has ever done before. And while that was true, that didn't necessarily make it enough to change the sort of general overall conditions, right? And so I think, it's very easy to sort of get caught up in the momentum and the excitement and the sort of like, all the stuff that you're doing, and it feels like so much, but that still may not be enough to counteract like a tenfold, campaign, spending on the other side, right? And so just, unrealistic expectations are a thing, not just in the Green Party, but I'm sure across the political spectrum. It is definitely something that, we need to sort of be more cognizant of. I mean, other times, obviously, your plan was flawed or more realistically not followed. I mean, it can be flawed if stemming from unrealistic expectations, but sometimes it's that people do campaign plans and then they almost get shelved or put in a drawer, or, like, they're just not referred to as, and like in a real living document kind of way. People get sort of caught up in the moment. Some opportunity comes along that you didn't anticipate, and suddenly you're off chasing that instead of like what you originally decided to focus on. And so I think sometimes that also leads us to have, to get different results from than what we planned. And then obviously there's other times where there's just circumstances beyond your control, right? COVID happens, right? Or, the opposition candidate gets, thrown in jail, or who knows? I mean, all kinds of crazy stuff happens that are just completely beyond your control that changes the course of the campaign. Gloria, I see your hand.
Yeah, no, I think that's important. And so kind of what I'm thinking is, could as candidates and campaign staff volunteer, the kind of the higher level volunteers that are in strategy, how do you keep the campaign plan like alive and visible, right? Because you put a lot of work in the beginning, and then, as you said, things happen or people don't even go through it. And maybe that's just something people start their meetings with, or even take a portion. But we'll say it is a balance, right? Because you do want to be able to pivot if something extraordinary happens. Like when I was running for city council in 2001, I had my campaign down in terms of my message and everything else, and how we were gonna, really go after the Democrat. Was Bill de Blasio, his first run, by the way. And then it was September 11th on primary day. And as Greens, even though I was running for city council, can't really want to talk about war, but you could certainly talk about, money spent abroad on war, and then the war at home. You have to be able to, like, how do I weave the message of my campaign and my like 3 main or 5 main platform plans, something that may have happened unexpectedly.
I mean, I think that's a great point, right? So chances are something of the magnitude of September 11th is probably not going to happen, but you never know. And I think you're right. It is that balance of being sort of flexible and dynamic, but also not being like chaotic and, and almost like schizophrenic, where you're just like constantly changing and chasing, some other thing. And so I think it's a matter of, I think revisiting, like, whenever there's sort of a major decision point, like, should we spend our limited resources on X or Y? Well, let's go back to the campaign plan. And, a plan is just a plan, right? It's not written in stone, but you have to ask yourself, like, if we're going to do something different that's not in the plan, do we have like a real reason for it? or, are we just like shooting it off at the hip kind of thing? And so I think, for me, one of the classic examples or sort of, I think, tensions is, especially in a race where and I'm going to say like, not necessarily not intending to win, but using this race as a building block for future campaigns. I think it's more important in those situations to do a lot of like the slow, long work of, building relationships in communities, like really setting like that sort of long-term party building and getting people like into the Green Party tent, as opposed to sort of just chasing the highest number of votes. And then, what do we have to show for it, come the next day. And so that long-term, like, ground war, so to speak, where people are doing that door knocking and outreach and like really cultivating real relationships is sort of, it's really unsexy, right? And it takes time and it doesn't necessarily seem to yield, it may not yield results in terms of votes this cycle, right? But I think so sometimes I think then you have a campaign where that's planning to do that, but then like some, media opportunity comes along, or something like, somebody comes in who's like, oh, we can do, like an ad on television for only this amount of money, or like, they come up with these things that are not really focused on that local sort of personal touch. And, we don't necessarily have the resources to do both. And so I think that's the moment where I see a lot of campaigns sort of chase some other thing, like a billboard or some other, something that's going to have like very broad, but like thin appeal, as opposed to sort of the narrow and deep. And I think, not that you can't do both, but I think oftentimes you kind of have to make a decision. So I don't know. But I think you're right. Like things do change, and you don't want to have it so rigid that, it's like, you're like, that wasn't in the plan, therefore we can't do it. But to really think about like, well, if we're going to change the plan, like why? And have a real reason. And again, some of these measures are quantitative, like you can count the number of volunteers, the number of donations, the number of doors knocked, the number of, mailers sent, whatever. But some of them are qualitative. And so, things like, the volunteers that showed the most promise as future leaders or even future candidates, people who got trained up to do something really well, who are now like, oh, that person can be another person's treasurer, or that person can be another person's media director. So, some of it is just like the talent cultivation is like a really important thing to sort of note and reflect and look back on. All right. So, the big goal, of course, is to generate these takeaways, right? What do we learn that we can use the next time? I think the other thing that I really encourage campaigns to do in conjunction with ideally with a local or state party, is to like, what's your plan for saving your data, right? Hopefully you have developed databases, whether it's Excel spreadsheets or CRMs like Nation Builder or whatever other things. You have lists of people who donated money, of people who volunteered, of people who signed up to be on your mailing list. Don't throw that away. Like, don't let that stuff just expire. Hand it over to either save it for yourself for your next run, or hand it over to your local, state, or even national party. Because those people are likely, Green Party donors and Green Party voters and Green Party volunteers, if they were motivated from your campaign. And so you want, and then, whether it's you who runs in that same seat next time around or somebody else, like that is an invaluable gift that you can give the next person so that they're not starting from scratch, right? It's so hard to start from scratch. It is a million times easier to start with like, well, we at least have these 100 volunteers or 100 donors from the last race. And so ideally you want to build on that history, and always be sort of, improving the quality of your data, but retaining and knowing who's been involved with what over time. Also just like the infrastructure and practices, like, the tools that you're using, like, was it Nation Builder or something else? Did you set up a weekly Zoom? Did you use a Google Drive? Did you like use some like, MailChimp, whatever, whatever tools that you're using, you don't want to reinvent the wheel the next time around. And so just all of those lessons learned, even things like, if you have paid staff, like, well, how did you run payroll, or did you do 1099s, whatever, those are all things that the next person has to figure out. But if you've already figured it out and you've kind of almost written up a little manual or a little guide about how to do this in this community, where to get your lawn signs, where the best printing prices are, all of those things that's information that somebody else can use without having to do all that same legwork that your campaign might have had to do. And so that can be really helpful. And then, especially also information about your opponent. So like, assuming you maybe lost your election and the person you ran against is now the elected school board person, city council president, whatever. Well, what did you learn about them? Because 4 years from now, whoever we're going to be running against that same person, probably who's running for their own reelection. And so if we already know, like, what do we already know about Bill de Blasio from 2001 that we can use when he runs in, 2015 or whatever it was for mayor, right? So that's the kind of thing that can also be really useful. Right. And then, and on that same note, in terms of opposition research, now that you have some time and space, and so this is getting beyond the initial debrief, but this is just sort of like, what you might do in December, January, look at your opponent's financial reports. Who gave them money? Who gave them endorsements? What did they spend their money on? There might be some really fishy things going on there, but there also might be just like other things that were great opportunities, like, oh, look, they used such and such printer. I wonder what kind of deal they got. Or, oh, they tabled at this event, maybe we could have done that next time around. And there also could be like, financial conflicts of interest that might be worth calling out. The more you can know about your opponent, the better. And now you have another 4 years to sort of do that research. Because again, this might be the person that you're going to run against next time around. You want to be careful in terms of, and this is both especially for the in-person debrief or the Zoom debrief, whatever you're doing, but in general, like, again, campaigns can get very heated and emotional. It's a very like stressful sort of sense of urgency, November 2nd, whatever, like it's a very, high intensity kind of thing. Try really, really hard. It's not about people. It's not about placing blame. It's not about, blaming so-and-so because they didn't do what they said they were going to do. Talk about the actions, not the person, right? And also just be realistic. Like, a lot of us are volunteers. We have day jobs, we have families, we have other things. And so it's very common for people to sort of overpromise and underdeliver because we all have the best of intentions. But I think, just be realistic about, like, well, how much free time does this person have? And if the answer is 5 hours a week, but we're giving them a job that's like 30 hours a week, it's not their fault that they're constantly disappointing us, right? Like, it just is what it is, right? And so I think just getting a little bit of, having a little bit of like giving people grace while also trying to hold people to high standards, because, again, it is that balance. So being a little realistic about the time and capacity of your group and yourself as a candidate is also really important. Some other things to think about as you move toward, wrapping up your campaign is, also thinking about like, well, how did the local or state Green Party interact with your campaign? Some campaigns and the local party are almost like one and the same, right? It could be that your local party asked you to run in order, like, we need a candidate for school board, so-and-so, will you please run? And essentially the local party was your campaign operation. In other cases, it's totally separate, and the candidate sort of builds their own team and base of support that may have some Greens involved, but may have some other folks involved. And the connection to the local or state party may be a little less, direct. And so kind of exploring that and debriefing that is really important. Was it the right mix? Like, was that relationship too close, too far, too distant? How did it feel? did you get, seek and receive endorsements from your local or state party? How much did the local or state party promote you, and vice versa? How much did you, promote the Green Party? Was it obvious that you were running as a Green? Was 10 key values in the 4 pillars like on all of your lit? And you might consider, depending on how active folks were, it's a two-way street. Like, what did you feel about the Green Party relationship to your campaign, but also what did they feel about your campaign's relationship to the party? And sometimes this can also be, a little difficult. I find, that some people are more attracted to campaigns and some people are more attracted to party building. They're in some ways different. I don't want to say different skill sets, but it's almost like a different orientation. I often liken, running for office is like a sprint and running the party is a marathon. And like most people are not both sprinters and marathon runners. And so sometimes there can just be like a tension there because of people who have just different, perspectives and interests and, preferences for their engagement. I think the last thing here, last couple of slides before we can just discuss is, you also want to think about ways to translate, and I feel like we have a whole other call on this topic that we usually do in December, but, how do you take all the things that you learned, the infrastructure you built, the momentum you generated from your campaign and funnel it into the party? Like, how do you get your volunteers to, we're coming to your office once a week or going door knocking every couple of weeks, or a case of campaign here in Pennsylvania this year, they were phone banking once a week. And not that they necessarily have to phone bank once a week for the Green Party, but can they phone bank once a month for the Green Party? Like, how do we take that momentum and energy and not just let it all die because now it's December? How do we get folks to sort of stay with it but shift from the candidate to general party building? And so that really is the challenge. It's the type of thing that really, I think, is the ideal, is that like all of these things are sort of, building one upon another, the party to the campaign to the party. Holly, I see your hand is up.
So yeah, just building on what you just said, one of the things that I have seen over and over and over again, especially during the quadrennial presidential campaign years, everything is done, everything is over, everyone is finished. And so everybody who's been working on this would like to take a little break, and of course it's good to have psychologically knowing that you're going to do a little bit of post-campaign work, but you want to break. I think it was inevitably what happens is somebody shows up and says, what are you working on now? I wasn't involved with the campaign, but I really want to get involved now. And I thought, oh, geez, it's like everybody else wants to take a break, but it might be a good idea to have, and this can be campaign planning or not, but just for the party to have an idea of something, some project or something that they can go forward with post-campaign. And you kind of mentioned that, but to have planned out ahead of time so you can say, yes, we're working on this great initiative of the neighborhood or something.
Yeah. In fact, I think actually I'm going to skip ahead to this one example, and this clearly came from Michael and Gloria last year, is can your candidate shift to issues, right? So in some ways, like your candidate doesn't have to disappear, right? It's not like, oh, the race is over, now I go underground and I turn everything over to the party, right? Like your candidate can still be active. Like, so even if the candidate lost, like they're still a leader in the community. They still have important things to say. We have a guy here in Pennsylvania, Jay Sweeney, he runs every year. In fact, I think he's now been elected to like something small, like township auditor. But, when he ran for state senate, like several times, and whenever there's a controversial issue going on in his community, like the newspaper will call him and be like, hey, Jay, what's the Green Party perspective on X, right? And so your candidate can still have visibility, right? You do a local party press release January, February about some issue, you can still quote the candidate, right? Like they can still be a spokesperson, a voice. And so I think, picking up on an issue that's the next like an issue campaign to sort of tide you over to the next electoral campaign is kind of the way to go. And I saw Gloria's hand up, so I hope she wants to like give us the example of what she did in Brooklyn.
Well, I think both you and Holly really, kind of laid it out really perfectly. And it's likely, especially for a local campaign, that your name as the candidate, was more visible, although obviously, I certainly in all my runs was very clear about being Green Party. I think most of us are talking about that too, is like, so how do you bring people into the party, or is as a possibility, right, to continue the issue? So my issue for borough president, city council, there are other issues, but borough president was eminent domain and the big development that was going to happen close to my district. And so when the campaign was over, we did a couple events around that. We showed the Walmart film had come out. It was a long time ago, right? And a couple of other things around gentrification and housing. So we kept that going. So we said, like, come to a meet and greet, come and watch this film hosted by, former, Green Party candidate for borough president, right, Gloria Matera. But so you could make the candidate kind of keep the momentum going for people who really like the campaign or like to support that candidate. But you gradually, as Hillary said, you want to create a space where they could work on an issue or two. So even if they are not like, hey, I'm going to join the local Green Party yet, if they're not Greens already, they might want to continue to work in coalition. Maybe they're connected to other organizations. So that does build for the next run or for somebody else to run. And I think in general, just working with people locally or regionally on issues is always something, kind of something good to show that we participate in both.
Definitely. And I think just on this point, another way, that the candidate can be super helpful. And in fact, we just did this at the national level, is like the candidate writing like, an email appeal or a direct mail appeal or something, like to their supporters saying, please now give your attention, your money, your time to the party. And so, nationally, we just had Howie Hawkins basically author a direct mail appeal to both his donors and some of our donors and our base, to sort of like generate more money for the party itself, because he's obviously a known entity and people responded and were excited about him. And so it's, again, he's basically trying to help move his supporters into our tent, the ones at least that weren't already there in the first place. All right, I see some more hands up. Tim, you haven't spoken. So Tim, why don't you take the floor?
Okay, just on like things between running for office or outside of running for office, an example that comes to mind is in 2020, Andrew Yang ran for Democratic presidential nomination, and then afterwards he started Humanity Forward, nonprofit organization. So that's also like an approach you could take, like for focusing on like an issue or narrow range or broader range of issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a little bit of a danger in that, and maybe I'm too much of a party partisan, but that to me is a way to sort of keep your donor base to yourself in some ways. Like, he's not saying, okay, everyone, now go build your local Democratic Party. He's kind of saying, actually stay with me and continue on my journey with this thing that I'm creating. So it's a little bit that can be a little bit of a tension. And not that you can't do both, right? Like there are ways to sort of keep your own thing going on. And there's plenty of candidates who have pivoted to either creating 501c3s or 501c4s, like advocacy groups. But you also want to, ideally, really build that bridge to the party, at least in our case, the party itself. Because we also don't really want to be creating like cults of personality either, where it's just that person and their own thing, and it never sort of feeds back into the overall party. So I think it's a balance.
I mean, I guess I can also kind of go the opposite direction, where I'm reminded of like Teddy Roosevelt passing the torch to Howard Taft, and then like afterwards seeing Taft in action, Teddy, I guess, kind of regretted doing so. So like for example, if you're focused on certain issues, and like if the party kind of like can change issues, or if a lot of the candidates are more personalities, or you just have like a really big tent and things just bounce around a lot, like there can be sometimes a conflict between party and like a set of issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why, I would argue for like just an ongoing engagement. So it's not so much like a passing the torch or the baton, but sort of like bringing your resources into the bigger tent and still being engaged, right? So that you're not like yeah, you're not like passing the torch and like, okay, like it's not, I'm out of here, it's the next guy, but like you're still involved, right? Like we would still want Howie to be engaged in discussing and debating and helping choose this, the next candidate, right? And he will be. It's not just simply like a pass the torch, it's a, bring resources back into the party and also stay involved as a member, as a leader. I think Gloria, was your hand up from before? Did you have something new to add? And then I saw Holly. Or your hand is down, so I think Holly, you're next.
Yeah, I was just going to say, your mention of Andrew Yang struck me. And one thing I wanted to note, there's one thing that people don't go into this realizing many times, but there's such a huge gulf of difference between the size, even though the Green Party is among the leftish parties, one of the larger, I think, in the country. But when you compare that to the major parties, it's huge. Huge difference. And among the Democrats, I live in Iowa, so we get the benefit of all the campaign and the pre-presidential campaigning, including Yang and Warren and Sanders and everybody else. And all of these people represent a different stream. Almost, it could be in some of the cases like Bernie Sanders or perhaps Yang, a party in themselves. So that's another thing to consider. And someone wants to start, they're still thinking of going into the Democratic Party and not really going off by themselves, but they're trying to push, and ultimately in the end it's pushing policy, and what policy do we want to enact in the communities, even above party building, I would say. But in our case, we need that party building, and that. But that's you struck me when you mentioned Andrew Yang, especially because I know he had a couple of very, very strong positions that he wanted to promote, and his promoters were, or his supporters were promoting those. So, that's a way of getting a PAC and then influencing the major party. I don't know that would be great for the Green Party right now, but
yeah, I mean, there's a fine balance between, right, like there's obviously different strands and thoughts within the party, but we're sort of not big enough to have hopefully to have huge factions, right? We really need to all work together.
I was going to say, I think our platform is actually a little more coherent or cohesive when it comes to that.
Sure.
When it comes to that, yeah,
Okay.
That's an easier thing for us.
All right, I just wanted to go back because I know I skipped over one slide that I think was important, and so this is just other sort of post-campaign party building things that you could be doing. I mean, obviously, thank your volunteers. Like, thank people who helped you, who donated, who supported, who are out there. Make sure everyone gets thanked. And then this sort of organized run, like I think we also have to get into like the sprint and the marathon go together, and maybe it's more like a relay race, right? It's, and maybe without that handoff, but the idea is that you want to be running campaigns that build the party, and you want to be building the party to support the next campaign, right? So like there's sort of this iterative process. And, ideally it's sort of all like, it's a positive feedback loop. So that, the issue campaign that you're maybe running in an off year feeds into the next actual campaign for office. You're identifying leaders, you're identifying, future donors, future volunteers, you're building infrastructure, you're learning who's who in the community that you can count on, all of those types of things. The former candidate, again, can still be a spokesperson, right? Can still be out front, can still be out there. So, right, like if you lost city council, you should still show up to city council meetings and see what's going on. See what's happening, when they debate XYZ. Well, what would you have done if you had been elected? Put out a press release. Why not? Speak, create moment, like keep the fire burning, particularly if you're planning to run again in 4 years or 2 years or whatever the case may be. But even if you're not, use it as a way to so that the Green Party, like, turn into that sort of watchdog role, right? So like you're no longer actively campaigning, but you're watching and you're noting what's going on, and you're still messaging to your supporters like, hey, did you see what they just did in City Hall this week? I roll, like, this is how the Green Party would have done it differently. And so, just sort of keep the momentum going. and then a best practice here is that the campaign list and social media should cross promote local party announcements for the next 3 to 6 months. So a lot more like an intensive period where, if the party is doing an event, the campaign is putting it out to its supporters. So just sort of like, that's sort of that like slow handoff warm up to sort of try to transition donors and volunteers from the candidate and the campaign into the party. So that's basically it, I think. These were the final examples that we've already talked about. I know we have a small group here. I'm going to stop sharing so that we can see each other. But yeah, any other comments? I don't know how, like, Scott, you have campaign experience, how much any of this ring true for you? But yeah,
yeah, no, definitely. I'd like to add some. I ran twice for state representative in Massachusetts, and I was pretty active in the local community, serving on boards and things. So people knew me. I ran against a very entrenched Democratic incumbent with family spread far and wide in the district, and I didn't have expectations that I was going to win. But I did scare him a lot, and that was quite thrilling. And I got 18%, 20% in that range. And I was a little bit disappointed because there was only 2 people in the race. But what I realized afterwards is that even at that level, I had power. And as you said, issues would arise where I had a different position, and newspapers and press and local leaders would contact me for my opinion. What's your take on things? So for the years following the election, and we had somebody running in the adjoining district as well, a Green Rainbow Party candidate, and we both did, pretty well. So we had power. We had people talking to us. We had people joining us. We had people, I was on the Rolodexes of the media people. And so I was always being called, and I was, very mindful that the campaign really didn't end on election day. There's always the opportunities to move forward and gain power are always there. And in my role now, sort of advising Green Party candidates in Washington State, and I wish there were a whole lot more than we have, but that's an important element to consider, especially if they seek and get party endorsement. So I wanted to thank you for this session today. The deck was really helpful. I see myself maybe using this as I debrief candidates that we have in Washington State. And one thing that I want to add, I mentioned that I spoke to our candidate following the election and did a little bit of a debriefing, hoping that he was going to remain in the area and be active, but he is moving. So he's planning to move to another location and get involved in kind of, not really start over, but be active with the different groups. So I didn't go in the direction of, okay, what are we going to do to build the Green Party in Forks, Washington, which is where he was. But based on this presentation today, it's like certainly I'm going to go back to him and say, okay, well, who were your volunteers who helped you? Who were your supporters there? And you might be leaving town, but are there others that are likely to stay that we want to stay in touch with? Because campaigns are our best opportunity to grow power, in my opinion.
Yeah,
we don't have enough of them. We have more than our opponents say we do, but we don't have enough.
Right. Those were all
great
points.
So I wanted to thank you very much. I hope I can get a copy of the deck.
Yeah.
And I hope it's like, as the need arises, we can reach out to you and the people who put this together to make use of it. Found it very helpful.
Yeah. So I just put a link in the chat that is the Coordinated Campaign Committee's website. What's actually our webinar list. And so I'll put the recording up of this. I'll put the slide deck up. As I mentioned, this is basically a copy of the 2020 slide deck that we used a year ago, and that is already on our website. So if you just scroll down to the 2020, it's the very first thing. You could also watch the Gloria and Michael version of this presentation from a year ago that we'll put up tonight's recording as well. But yeah, I mean, take these tools, right? Like we have tons of other slide decks for other parts of campaigning, get out the vote. building your campaign team, developing databases, like all kinds of stuff. And, we're also looking to do campaign schools, sort of maybe like more intensive, like, half day to full day, like trainings from soup to nuts. This is the season to do that, right? As people sort of start gearing up for 2022. I think we do have a campaign school in Oregon that we're going to be like zooming into. And in February, and that would be great for folks from Washington State, because it's by East Coast standards. I want to say, oh, it's not far, it's right next door, but I know it's like probably still it could be an 8-hour drive depending on where you are. But relatively speaking, it's not that far away. And so that's something that we can make sure you know of as well.
Thank you very much.
Sure. All right. Well, it's 10:01 on the dot, at least here in the East Coast. I guess 10 in the morning in Vietnam. And so I guess I'll thank you all for coming. I know, this was a small group, but I think the people are still probably madly exhausted from any race that they were running a week ago and not yet ready to like think about anything, let alone debriefing. But so I really appreciate you all joining us, and whoever's watching this afterwards, good luck with all your debriefing. And if you're watching this at the beginning of a race, this is, I think, starting with the end in mind, thinking about, these are the questions you're going to ask yourself a year from now. And so what are the things that you want to put in place, particularly that campaign plan, so that you can answer these questions well a year from now. So that's it. Any other announcements, Holly?
No, just if you want to be on our webinar email list, just send your email to ccc@gp.org and we'll get that on. And you'll hear about the next upcoming webinars. You'll also see them listed, I think, on any e-blast and stuff we do, but you can check. We usually do this about once a month. So, and thank you all for coming, and thanks all for input. That's always helpful to hear from people around the country.
Great. Take care, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks,
All
everyone.
right, thank you.